across disciplines and spaces to be a regular feature of the intellectual life of Cambridge and promoting the sharing and discussion of insights and ideas pertaining to Indigenous studies across peoples, disciplines, times, and geographies. We are holding this event in collaboration with the Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group. The aim of the discussion group is to foster conversation and knowledge sharing around the important issue of heritage and decolonization with those dealing with these issues from a diverse range of backgrounds and experiences. My name is Christos Nicolaou, and I am a second-year PhD student at the Department of Archaeology here at the University of Cambridge. This evening's event is a screening of the documentary Honey at the Top. The film revolves around the Sengwer forest people in the Chirangari Hills of Kenya being evicted from their ancestral land in the name of conservation. The film centers around father of two Elias as he works with his community to try and hold onto their culture and resist the evictions. It is an intimate portrait of this community at a crossroads, facing international pressure from organizations like the World Bank, a corrupt Kenya Forest Service, who are burning their houses, and attempts to turn the forest into a commodity through carbon offsetting schemes. After the screening, which will run just over an hour, there will be a Q&A with Dr. Sam Lunn-Rockliffe. Dr. Sam Lunn-Rockliffe is a research fellow at the Institute for Global Prosperity at UCL. His research focuses on the archaeology of the recent past and contemporary world in Africa, exploring social life through everyday objects and landscapes in order to foreground histories, memories, and things that are otherwise obscured by dominant development narratives. He undertook his PhD in archaeology at the University of Oxford, where he studied the long-term history and livelihoods of the different Kalenjin communities facing a series of evictions from the Mbobut forest in Western Kenya. He has since continued this work through the British Museum's Endangered Material Knowledge Program, where he documented the material practices and ecological knowledge associated with Indigenous beekeeping. At his current post, he has been working to build a wider historiographical and ethnographic understanding of environmental management and agricultural practice in the same region for the construction of citizen-led policy interventions. This work places a heavy emphasis on empowering local voices, knowledge, and practice for pluralizing how we may design new agricultural futures. We are honored to host him in a discussion and Q&A later this evening. Before we begin the screening, I'm going to make housekeeping announcements, mostly pertaining to our virtual audience. We will shortly post a link to the film in the Zoom chat, along with the password to access it. Please return to the Zoom link after the screening, which is when we will begin the Q&A. When in the Zoom meeting, please keep your microphone turned off. During the Q&A, if you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function to send a message to the general chat or to the ISDG Cambridge account, and we will read it aloud. If you want to ask the question yourself, please let us know that in the chat and we will unmute your microphone. The Q&A portion of the event will be recorded, so please keep that in mind and keep your cameras on or off as you prefer. By remaining in the room, as we record the meeting, you consent to be recorded. The recording will be available on the CRASSH website and on the ISDG Cambridge YouTube channel soon after the event. Captioning has been enabled for the Q&A. If you would like to have captioning, you can select it at the bottom of your screen. Please note that captions are provided by Zoom and CRASSH cannot be held responsible for the accuracy. Rest assured, you will be able to revisit the Q&A recording on YouTube. We are doing our best to provide an inclusive environment in this hybrid event. It goes without saying that all attendees are expected to show respect and courtesy to the speakers and each other throughout the event. Without further ado, we will now send the link to the film in the Zoom chat, and we will reconvene in the Zoom meeting in an hour. Enjoy the film, everyone. So welcome back everyone for the Q&A portion of the Honey at the Top event screening. We are now joined by Dr. Sam Lunn-Rockliffe, and we will turn to the audience to see if there are any questions they would like to pose. I'd like to start with a general question. Could you tell us more about the broader region and how that relates to, conservation and the World Bank and so on and so forth?
Yeah, sure. So the film is set in a county in northwest Kenya called Elgeyo-Marakwet County, and it's a fairly sort of long, narrow county, and it's almost dissected in half, sort of lengthways, by a huge escarpment called the Elgeyo Escarpment. And east to west, you have an elevation increase of about 1.5 kilometers, maybe even a little bit more, from the semi-arid plains of what's called the Kerio Valley, all the way up to the highland forests, which is where the film is set. And the reason why the World Bank have been involved, and it's really important in conservation narratives, is that the Emberwood Forest is one of Kenya's 5 water towers, or at least the Emberwood Forest is a part of a wider ecosystem, which is one of Kenya's 5 water towers. And that wide area is called the Cherangani Hills. And those Cherangani Hills make up the broader part of western Elgeyo-Marakwet County, and they also cross over into 2 neighboring counties called Trans-Nzoia and West Pokot. So across that whole sort of broader region, you have a really sort of dynamic set of livelihoods and ecologies. In the Kerio Valley, you've got both pastoral communities, and that crosses over actually into Baringo County, which is where Nick has been working. You can call that, you can probably chime in as well. And in the valley, you also have Marakwet communities who have been farming there for about 250 years. And what's really interesting about the Marakwet is that they've been distributing water from the highland forests through a huge sort of network of irrigation furrows for, pretty much 250 years to sustain their sort of diverse agricultural practices, given that it's so dry down there. And then as you go up the escarpment into the highland forests, people were traditionally hunting and gathering and foraging and beekeeping, but also keeping small amounts of cattle in, and they mentioned in the film, these forest glades, which is essentially just like small openings in the forest, which is sort of naturally occurring around rivers. But then throughout the latter half of the 20th century into the 21st, the amount of farming has increased in the area, which has sort of given rise or given worry to the amount of deforestation due to agriculture, which is why kind of these conservation narratives have become so prevalent today, although they've got sort of deep roots from early colonization. So that's sort of, broader region, a bit of context about the area. I mean, it would be useful if I could show on Google Maps, but I don't think we should start faffing around with that.
I have another question, actually. Do you know why the World Bank has such a vested interest in the area? Well, it might have a vested interest.
The World Bank funding was set up, had a body of funding for what was called the National Resource Management Team, which is basically a sort of pot of money that has been used to fund projects around the world to develop and manage their natural resources for the betterment of, this is from their perspective, from the betterment of livelihoods in that nation state or that country or whatever wider sort of region. So their relationship to carbon markets is actually, there's like one step removed. They're not directly getting, or at least when this was released and being developed, they weren't directly getting money through carbon markets. They were helping Kenya set up so that they could tap into, the nation state could tap into carbon markets. But from the World Bank's perspective, I'm pretty sure that they wanted to fund management schemes so people could better manage the natural resources. But the problem with this is they just threw money at it and said, here you go, this is, you deal with it and see what happens.
Right.
So I had another question about the increase in agriculture. So what drove that, and how did it link into like previous narratives of conservation? That, because you mentioned they have deeper roots in colonization. And
So the history of agriculture in the region it's pretty complex, but it's oldest in the Kerio Valley, which is at the lower elevations. Part of the growth of agriculture in the highland forests came from the introduction of new hybrid forms of maize cultivation, and these forms of maize were much more productive within the forest ecosystems, or at least at those elevations. Previously, people who were living in the forest were moving down to the valley. They were trading meat, honey, all sorts of other forest resources for things like sorghum and finger millet and even maize in the valley. But with the introduction of new forms of cultivars and cereal crops, people started realizing, I don't have to walk down a kilometre in elevation for 3 days to trade. I could actually start farming up in the area. But the conservation landscapes, as it were, they were imposed well before people were cultivating in that area. They emerged from essentially colonial philosophies as to how best to protect an environment for ecosystem management. And that philosophy was it shouldn't have humans in it because humans will degrade that environment. So throughout the 20th century, it's a massive part of British sort of colonial approaches to conservation, which is what you might have heard of, fortress conservation or fines and fences. So anyone inside the fence circle will be fined and kicked out. And their anxieties or their drive to do this was multifaceted. It was one, because forest resources were a useful resource for things like the locomotive industry initially, but also other building materials and construction. But also two, there were genuine fears that if the forest depleted, so too would water retention and water access downstream. So yeah, but their approach was humans shouldn't be there because they're the ones causing the damage. So
were there any prior practices of eviction in colonial times? Has this been a pattern?
Yeah. They essentially displaced and moved communities all around the place all the time in loads of different ways and for loads of different reasons. The KFS who talks about in this, it's essentially just an inherited approach from colonial forms of conservation. There's a real lack of imagination as to how to better involve communities and use community knowledge and practice in a much more innovative way and positive way as to how to manage those resources. I don't know. Input? What happened to Baringo?
I mean, I agree fully because kind of I'd say the ideas of displacement for like forest conservation, for example, the earliest instance that I'm aware of is, I think it's France and Morocco or Algeria, one of those, where pastoralists who were using kind of those oases and forest resources and were occasionally kind of burning the shrub. Like they were continually pushed out. Their lands were what's the word now? Like the government took control of it, the French government, being like, and imposed all sorts of restrictions, like if you're not on the land permanently, then it's ours, and so on. And that kind of these series of ideas also about deforestation, they were happening in Europe at the same time with the Alps, and they just kind of blanket approach to the colonies. And the other point was, I think one of the like it was a case of one of the islands being settled. Can't remember. I think it was in the Caribbean. Serious deforestation for various amounts of resources, and then yes, there in that island ecosystem, you had severe degradation. And kind of the British then also just adopted that approach. It was a prevalent called ideology about fortress conservation, and that the best environment. So if you leave nature alone, so to say, without humans, then you'll get the pinnacle of nature. So that's why he was at the same kind of in Baringo. So that's that east, and kind of up another set of hills, and yeah, there they pretty much kind of, like, there was a area for the local communities, and around it was white settler farms, which kind of hemmed in communities. They're not supposed to go in there. There's a whole kind of history of trespassing because of it. And kind of still continues today with violence in what was it, 2 years ago, 3 years ago? It was pretty bad. Yeah. So kind of there's an ongoing history of.
You mentioned something about white settler farms, and I was just thinking about like the livestock they had in the film, like sheep. I don't know if they were like native to the region.
Yeah, they have merino sheep up there, which were introduced.
Right,
They
yeah.
were introduced in like the 80s, 70s and 80s, I think. And it was a part of a sort of, no, it must have been well before that. I think, because Kenya was independent in 63. I think they're introduced by the British administration, I'm not sure. But essentially trying to set up a sheep trade, wool, meat, etc. And the environment up there is perfect for those merino sheep because they're way more productive than the Maasai sheep, which you get in much more arid areas. And then also a lot of the cows you'll see are introduced as well.
So you also mentioned citizen-led initiatives. Obviously, the conservation system is very much restricted in that sense. But have there been any grassroots initiatives that?
Yeah, this is what I'm actually proposing to go on to do some research on, because from being on the ground and meeting people, so there's a ton of community-based organizations and sort of grassroots initiatives that play out in sort of different ways, but I don't know how effective these have been. I think there's a general consensus that there's not much, well, some people think there's not much future for them at all there anymore, so they're just leaving the area completely, or just building their livelihoods entirely outside of the forest. Other people reckon and think or state that the best way forwards is to revive an old way of life. But actually a lot of people don't have an appetite for that either, because, I mean, when they're in Eldoret, they're talking about the court case, and someone says, we can get rid of cultivation, we'll just eat nettles and milk and meat. Nettles is called kimele. They're just like a form of stinging nettle, but they make a really good, like, green leafy green vegetable that I ate quite a lot when I was there. But loads of people think, eating nettles, that's what my grandparents did. I don't want to do that. I can eat maize and stuff, or I can do other things. So there's not an appetite really to amongst community members to go sort of to revive an old sort of traditional lifestyle, as it were. But I'm not sure, it's not certain to me as to how people do want to move forward from a community point of view. I think there's all sorts of ideas about tree nurseries, indigenous tree nurseries, and small plantations. But the difficulty with it is, how does that support livelihoods?
So a lot of it is to do with basically how people have just changed because of new technologies coming in. So
yeah, change for all sorts of reasons. I mean, loads of people I chatted to were like, I want to go back to the forest so I can plant my maize.
Mm-hmm.
And these might be people who have migrated there in the past 15 years. It might be people who've got much more of a sort of deep relationship with the forest, but planting maize for a lot of people, or any other form of leafy green, is like why they want to be in the forest. If they can't do that, then there was no point. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I've never landed on any form of conclusion of like how people would want to move forward, because I don't think it's a really, really tricky situation.
I don't think there is like a solution to it anyway. There's, yeah, my experience is people, I mean, as is, of course, like first and foremost, people will take care of their livelihood, make sure that they have enough food, so on.
Yeah.
And the, so to say, traditional or revival of past lifestyles or crafts just in vast majority of cases won't do that. Like you can have like craft specialists and so on, who can probably make money one way or another. But life's changed a lot. The like technology, mode of transportation, modes of trade is just all different now. And to one of the researchers working in my area is comparing pastoralists and their connection to the market. So from Baringo all the way up north to Turkana, East Turkana area. And he kind of showed that in Baringo, where the market is closest and where people most engage in kind of the capitalist way of trade, their kind of wealth has grown more than in other areas where like they are cut off from the market for various reasons. I guess it's the same in your area.
It's kind of reminding me of like sort of like recently in Borneo, there's been a land repatriation act. So a lot of native communities were granted land by the government, and a lot of them felt like, I don't know what to do with this land. And there was a certain point where like people were discussing whether to sell back the land to the government to make money. But now they've sort of been incentivized to like use it to farm, and all of them. It's weird because now everyone's using it to, I guess, have like independently grown oil palm farms. So like it's weird because it's like obviously when you think of oil palm, you think of these huge plantations, but there's like really small hectares of land where like native communities are now farming oil palm and then making money off of it without really doing that much damage to the environment they're in compared to like these big plantations. So I don't know, it's really interesting.
A lot of like resilience there, a lot of like resourcefulness and adapting to the times.
Yeah,
while also using the past and So we have one more question from Nishant in the chat. So who says there seem to be multiple legal frameworks simultaneously at play with the state legal system, as well as that of international monetary institutions and conservation organizations. In your research, do you also find the talk or activisms around systems of customary law?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Sorry.
So there's there in the movie there seem to be different legal frameworks at play, so customary law and the state law as well as international organizations. And Nishant's question was if in your research you've seen either customary law being invoked or activism around a sort of customary law system.
I guess like discourse around legality and how it kind of like shapes activism.
Massively. I think this pretty much made up the first third of my PhD. I don't know how much into the weeds you want to get. Like one of the there are several layers. One of them is and it's really hard in an African context, the idea of indigeneity. So the same way I will, and Elias, who I've met several times, will claim to be the true indigenous people to the Emmerich forest. But being indigenous vis-a-vis surrounding populations, who have actually had equally very complex histories of migration into the area, similar sorts of longevity and ancestry in the region, similar relationships with the forest, but maybe speak a very different dialect. But in appealing to indigeneity, they are able to, or it's a vehicle to speak to the United Declaration rights for Indigenous people, which is a legitimate piece of international law, which is being invoked, and rightly so to some extent, at the injustices experienced by the same way people for the eviction of the land. But in doing so, it also excludes actually their very neighbours, who are Marquette, who can't quite tap into the same Indigenous piece of legislation because they haven't quite got the same sort of terminology. And there's all sorts of discussions as to who is Marquette and who's saying where. This happens all the time across different ethnic groups across the region. So that's sort of one level. And another level, the same where, and Marquette for that sake, we'll talk about customary bylaws that existed well before any colonial form of administration or environmental protection, which was essentially tied to family lineages and who monitored and protected areas of forest. So the very simple things like you should not cut a tree without asking an elder from your family lineage. You cannot cut trees, hunt, or build anything in anyone else's clan forest. And forests are literally marked by the topography of the land. So my land is, our clan or our land is divided. It ends at that gully there and it finishes that gully there. So this sort of like hillock or whatever is where we are allowed to enact our sort of activities. But I can't do so without speaking to elders who will have issued the rights for you to do so. And it's already issued rights. And those sort of bylaws, as it were, community bylaws, I spent a lot of time talking to people about this. They fizzled in the 80s and 90s in particular. And a lot of people, young people, just sort of like threw caution to the wind and were like, actually, I'm just going to cut bits of forest here, or I'm going to plant some potatoes here. And because, I mean, the main economy was changing, the main source of income for people's livelihoods. But in the film, and when I was talking to people, there was a real sense that these need to be reintroduced as a way of sort of expressing the community knowledge and traditional systems of land tenure as to how to control and protect the forest. And then the final piece of legislation that stood out was the Kenyan Constitution, which was introduced in 2010. But there's a particular article in that, which is like Article 63, which says that if you are a hunting and gathering community, you have rights to maintain access to your land. And the same way I'm constantly saying, we are traditionally a hunting and gathering community, and therefore we should not be evicted from these forests because our lives depend on them. So yeah, there's kind of broadly the sort of things around which people were talking and navigating. But with that came all sorts of complexities, nuances, and disagreements amongst the same way America themselves, but also amongst lawyers and wider and you know, academics.
So does the central state in Kenya, does it take a side in these disputes, or do they have a long?
Kenyan constitution, you won't find the word indigenous in it at all because of these very complexities, because it serves to further divide a nation which they're trying to unite under like a Kenyan identity. You start having people who are more indigenous than others, quote unquote, then people in the eyes of the state, the government, people have special rights when others don't, and then you should all be treated the same as Kenyans. I mean, comment further on the.
I feel like
the state
is trying to avoid giving anything, like the courts might rule against the state in certain instances, but I feel like the government isn't acting at all.
They would be, yeah.
Yeah, either or, it doesn't give any opinions.
There's a landmark case, I think like 2017, where the Panafrican Court ruled that the Ogiek community, who are a similar honeykeeping and hunting and gathering communities located in the Mau Forest, which is to the south of it, ruled that they'd been unlawfully evicted from their forests, but nothing came of it in terms of, and the evictions have continued since. There's been constant tension between Ogiek communities and the KFS and the Kent government. So I'm not sure that they won't act on anything.
So has this sort of pattern of ignoring court decisions at times, is that driven strictly from the drive to build sort of quote unquote unite the country? Is it also linked to Kenya's relationship to international organizations and what they expect from the country?
I mean, I don't really know. I'd be speculating, but I think certainly, I mean, the idea of Red and Red Plus, which is is it a UN scheme, Red Plus?
I think they put a stamp on it, but I don't think they developed it.
Have you heard of Red Plus?
No.
So it's basically the idea of carbon markets. So a country can grow a certain amount of trees, and people can, companies or countries abroad can offset their own carbon emissions by paying the nation state or whatever to for their carbon credits, basically. That's a very simple way of putting it. But to do that, you have to demonstrate that you're Red Plus ready. You're as a nation, you're Red Plus ready, which means you have to meet certain criteria as to your sustained planting trees, you're doing it in a sort of responsible way or whatever. But if you can do that, you can demonstrate and you can bring in a fair amount of money, basically, for further development. So that's certainly a pressure. Yeah, I don't know. As the short answer, I'd be speculating too much.
There seem to be a lot of stakeholders involved. Sometimes, we have a comment from Nishan. Thank you for the response. And the contested notions of indigeneity and the tensions between national and international law. There do seem to be so many stakeholders that it does seem like the interest and concerns of people on the ground are oftentimes drowned out by all these competing interests in a way. Are there any other questions from the audience, virtually or in person?
It was really, I haven't seen that film since, that's the third time I've seen it. The first time I watched it before I went. Second time was like a month in, and I watched it with people when I was out there. But now looking back at it, it's really strange because I know all of those places really, really intimately. So it's bizarre. It's bizarre to see it and recognize a lot of faces as well, but it's spoken to a lot of those people. It's a very, very intimate film. I think it's really brilliant. Yeah, was Dean supposed, because I wasn't involved in any of the film at all for people who were watching, whatever. Was Dean originally supposed to come to the event?
I have no idea. I can't believe
I've never met him. I've been in communication a little bit in the past, but
We're not sure specifically. But yeah, there seem to be no more questions, in which case I think it's a good time for us to close off. So in closing, I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Sam Lunn-Rockliffe, for taking the time to answer our questions here today. It's been an honor to have the opportunity to facilitate this discussion. And I think we've all really learned a lot today. Thanks as well to our audience here at CRASSH and on Zoom. Please keep an eye out on our website and YouTube channel to watch and share the recording of today's Q&A. And for more details and our full program of events, please visit our CRASSH website. The links will be posted in the chat. To get involved or give us feedback and suggestions for future events, write to us at the email IDs posted in the chat. Thank you and have a great rest of your evening, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.